Welcome in, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're looking into a pretty intense topic, actually.
Yeah.
The whole idea of state authority and, where's the line between individual responsibility and when the state itself kind of crosses the line into oppression.
Right.
And we're going to be looking at excerpts from a piece called State-Sanctioned Oppression and the Scope of Authority, a Biblical Perspective,
Okay.
written by Sarai Hannah Ajai.
Interesting.
So if you're into, ethics or social justice issues or even just how power dynamics work,
Right.
this deep dive is going to give you a lot to chew on.
Yeah, it sounds like this is a topic that's, not just some abstract philosophy. It's something
Right.
that plays out in the real world every day.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So the big question here is, in a just society, we expect individuals to be held accountable for their actions.
Of course.
But what happens when the state itself, the very system that's supposed to uphold justice, becomes part of the problem, when it's complicit in oppression?
That's a huge question.
Yeah, and the piece really drives this point home using Proverbs 17.15,
Right.
which says, acquitting the guilty and condemning the innocent, the Lord detests them both.
Wow.
And I don't know about you, but when I think about times I've seen that kind of injustice, even in small ways, it can leave you feeling kind of powerless.
Oh, absolutely. It's like that feeling of betrayal almost,
Yeah.
Like you expect the system to protect the innocent and punish the guilty.
Right.
And when it doesn't, it can shake your whole faith in the idea of justice.
Yeah, and what's even more concerning is that when those kinds of situations become normalized, it erodes our sense of what's right and wrong.
Right.
The author uses a verse from Isaiah to really highlight this,
Okay.
Isaiah 5.2. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil.
It's a scary thought when you think about it.
Yeah, and the piece doesn't pull any punches when it comes to talking about the misuse of power, particularly when officials use their positions for personal gain. It's not just presented as unethical behavior, but it's connected to a much deeper spiritual issue.
I see.
The author brings in Exodus 23.7,
Okay.
where it says, have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty.
Powerful words.
And it also points to Psalm 94.20-21,
Okay.
which emphasizes that God sees these corrupt practices and he doesn't just turn a blind eye.
That's reassuring.
Yeah, but then there's this interesting tension because the piece acknowledges that sometimes the wicked may flourish for a time.
Right.
That's from Proverbs 11.21.
Okay.
And I think we've all seen that happen in real life.
Oh, yeah.
Where it seems like injustice is winning. It can be so frustrating.
It is. It makes you question whether justice will ever prevail.
Yeah, exactly. And it's easy to get discouraged.
Definitely.
But the piece doesn't leave us there.
Yeah.
It reminds us that despite the frustration we might feel, God's justice ultimately wins out.
I like that. That's a good reminder.
Yeah, it points to Psalm 37.28,
Okay.
which assures us that God will not abandon those who are suffering unfairly.
That's a powerful thought.
Right.
It's not just about earthly justice.
Right.
It's about knowing that ultimately truth and righteousness will prevail.
Exactly. And, speaking of how this abuse of authority plays out,
Yes.
the piece gets into some really disturbing scenarios, particularly when those in power exploit innocent people's identities.
Right.
Sometimes to the point of enabling criminal activity.
It's heartbreaking to think about.
Yeah, and the language used to describe these actions is incredibly vivid.
Oh.
Ezekiel 22.27 calls these corrupt officials wolves tearing their prey.
It's a powerful image.
Yeah, it's a visceral image that really captures the violence and the heartlessness of these acts.
Yeah, it really drives home the impact of corruption.
Right. And to add to that, Isaiah 10.1-2 speaks out against leaders who establish systems that perpetuate injustice, specifically mentioning identity theft and wrongful persecution.
Issues that sadly are all too real for many people.
Absolutely. And what I find interesting is that the piece then kind of shifts gears a little bit and explores what might be at the root of this corruption.
I see.
It argues that this desire for status and approval, this constant need to compare ourselves to others, can actually be a driving force behind these kinds of abuses of power.
I could see that. When you're so focused on what others have or what they think of you, it can distort your priorities.
Absolutely. And let's be honest here, we've all fallen into that comparison trap at some point, haven't we?
Oh, for sure. It's so easy to get caught up in that, especially in today's world with social media and everything.
Right.
You're constantly bombarded with images of other people's seemingly perfect lives.
Yeah, it's like this pressure to keep up with a certain lifestyle, or
Exactly.
even to compromise our values just to fit in.
It's a real struggle.
And the piece uses Galatians 6.4-5 and 2 Corinthians 10.1 rule to address this very thing.
Okay.
It encourages us to focus on our own personal growth and stop seeking validation through external measures.
Right. It's about recognizing that true worth comes from within.
Exactly. And that's where the real danger lies, because the piece doesn't present comparison as just some harmless habit.
Right.
It highlights the deeper spiritual harm that it can cause.
It's like comparison becomes this poison that slowly eats away at your soul.
It is. It breeds pride and envy,
Yeah.
distracts us from God's unique plan for our lives,
Mm-hmm.
and can even make us judgmental of others.
And it takes our focus away from what truly matters.
Right. It's about recognizing that seeking validation from others can be a really empty pursuit.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's a good point to remember. It's so easy to get caught up in the external,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately true fulfillment comes from something much deeper.
Exactly. So instead of getting trapped in that cycle of comparison and chasing worldly success,
Right.
this piece is encouraging us to look inward and focus on something much deeper and more meaningful.
And that's where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
about understanding our own internal motivations and desires
Mhm.
and aligning them with something greater than ourselves.
Right. It's about a shift in perspective, a shift in our priorities.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be exploring further as we continue this deep dive.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to unpack here, so stay tuned.
Yeah, this is getting good.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
Sounds good.
So this idea that comparison can be spiritually harmful is a really fascinating point.
Yeah.
You were saying earlier that this piece encourages us to seek God's approval over man's.
Right.
But isn't discontent at least sometimes kind of a necessary thing to push for change?
That's okay.
Especially when we're talking about fighting against injustice.
I think it's about the kind of discontent,
Okay.
like righteous anger that fuels action versus envy and resentment that keeps us focused on ourselves.
Oh, I see. So it's more about channeling that discontent in a healthy way.
Exactly. Not letting it turn into bitterness or a desire to tear others down.
Yeah, and that makes sense because it ties back into the idea of individual accountability that we
Okay.
talked about earlier. We can't just point fingers at corrupt officials
Hmm.
and then act like we don't have any responsibility ourselves.
We all have a role to play in creating a more just world.
For sure. It's like that saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing.
Exactly. We can't be passive bystanders.
Yeah, but it can feel overwhelming sometimes.
Oh, I know.
Like, where do we even start? Especially when we're talking about something as big as state-sanctioned oppression.
It's true, these problems can seem huge, but the piece reminds us that change often starts small,
Okay.
with individual acts of courage and integrity.
So, like, what kinds of things are we talking about?
It could be speaking up when you see something wrong, refusing to participate in systems that perpetuate injustice,
Mm-hmm.
choosing honesty over deception even when it's hard.
So it doesn't have to be some grand gesture or protest or anything.
Right. Sometimes the most powerful change happens on a personal level.
Oh, okay. I like that.
Treating others with kindness and respect, refusing to engage in gossip or slander.
Right. Those everyday choices that we make.
Those everyday choices contribute to a culture of justice.
Yeah, and they add up.
Exactly. It's about cultivating virtues like compassion, humility, integrity, and forgiveness.
Yeah.
Those are the building blocks of a just and equitable society.
This makes me think about that quote from Ezekiel we talked about earlier about corrupt officials being like wolves tearing their prey.
It's a haunting image, isn't it?
It is. It makes the impact of corruption feel so real, so personal.
And it highlights the need for a different kind of leadership,
Yeah.
one that's rooted in service and compassion.
Right. Instead of greed and self-interest.
Yeah, and that's where I think this piece's focus on the dangers of comparison comes in.
Okay. How's that?
When we're constantly measuring ourselves against others, it's so easy to fall into those traps of envy, resentment, judgment.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're grounded in our own values, striving to live in accordance with God's will, we approach others with a different spirit.
A spirit of generosity and understanding.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can be really transformative.
For sure. For individuals and for society as a whole.
Like Mother Teresa said, we can do no great things, only small things with great love.
Those small acts of love and kindness can be the most revolutionary,
It's about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every single person.
regardless of their background or their circumstances.
And that brings us to a crucial point. This piece isn't just about condemning state-sanctioned oppression.
Right.
It's about offering a path forward, a way to build a better world where justice and righteousness prevail.
So if we want a society that reflects those values, it has to start with a change in our own hearts and minds.
Exactly. It's about examining our own motivations,
Right.
making conscious choices to act with integrity and compassion.
And we don't have to do this alone.
Right. The piece emphasizes the importance of community encouraging one another, spurring each other on toward righteousness.
There's power in collective action, isn't there? When we unite around shared values, a commitment to justice.
Absolutely. It creates a force for good that's far greater than any one individual.
And that leads us to the heart of what this piece is calling us to do.
To be agents of change in our own spheres of influence.
I think that's a perfect segue into the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
We'll explore that call to action more fully. What concrete steps can we take? How can we make a real difference in the face of these complex issues?
Those are the questions we'll grapple with as we move forward.
It's not always easy, but I think by having this conversation, by wrestling with these ideas,
Mm-hmm.
we're already taking a step in the right direction.
I agree. It's a journey and every step counts.
Okay, so we've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff here.
Yeah.
Corrupt systems, the dangers of comparison, the responsibility we all have to really push for justice.
It's a lot to process.
It is. And it can feel kind of overwhelming, honestly. Like, where do we even begin?
I hear you. It's easy to feel kind of paralyzed by how big these problems are.
Yeah.
But this piece offers both a challenge and a glimmer of hope.
Right.
It reminds us what Proverbs 14.34 says.
Hmm.
Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin condemns any people.
Wow, that's pretty direct.
It is. It's a call to action.
And it brings us back to, that question of how we can actually challenge this state-sanctioned oppression
Right.
within a framework of faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's not enough to just point fingers at corrupt officials.
We each have a role to play.
So what does that look like?
Well, it's going to look different for each of us.
Yeah.
For some, it might mean political activism,
Okay.
advocating for policy changes,
Yeah.
working within the system to hold those in power accountable.
Mm-hmm.
For others, it might be more about education, raising awareness about these issues,
Right.
having those tough conversations with friends and family who maybe hold different views.
And sometimes those conversations are the hardest ones.
They can be, but they can also be the most impactful.
Because you're really challenging those deep-seated biases and assumptions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The things that allow injustice to just keep going.
And it's about doing it with grace, right? Recognizing that everyone's on their own journey.
Of course, change doesn't happen overnight.
But even those small conversations, those little moments where you challenge the status quo, those can make a difference.
They plant seeds.
Yeah, like those ripples we were talking about earlier.
Right. Even the smallest act of courage, speaking truth to power.
It can create a ripple effect that goes way beyond just you.
And remember, we're not alone in this.
That's so important.
The piece really emphasizes the importance of community,
Okay.
supporting and encouraging each other in this pursuit of justice.
There's strength in numbers.
Absolutely. Knowing that you're part of something bigger.
Working towards a common goal.
Exactly. And that sense of community, of shared purpose, it can be incredibly empowering.
It gives you the courage to keep going.
Even when the challenges seem huge.
It reminds you that even when things seem really dark,
Yeah.
there's always hope.
As long as we're willing to keep fighting, keep pushing for righteousness,
Keep loving and supporting each other.
we can make a difference.
This whole conversation has really driven home the point about individual action
It's so easy to feel powerless.
when you're up against these huge systemic issues.
But this piece reminds us that even small acts of courage and integrity, they can have that ripple effect that leads to lasting change.
And that's a really powerful message to end on, I think.
Don't underestimate your own voice, your own actions.
Your own commitment to what's right.
You can make a difference.
Starting right now.
Right here, right now.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I want to thank you all for joining us.
It's been a journey,
It has been a challenging one.
but hopeful.
Definitely hopeful. Let's all go out there and be those ripples of change,
Yes.
working together to build a world that truly reflects justice and righteousness.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.